what is Wolff's Law? What is Wolff's Law and why do we care about it? You can unmute yourself or you can go ahead and type it into the chat. Please don't just copy and paste an answer off of like Wikipedia or something. Please. Okay, so are osteoblasts the ones that increase bone mineral density or decrease bone mineral density? Exactly. And then class are the ones that break it down, which I've obviously already talked about how I don't like the way that that is, that those were named, but that's just where we're at. Now, with Wolff's Law, remember your bones are constantly remodeling based upon the stresses you encounter. And the key is, guys, it's going to be the stress that that bone encounters. And what's the major way that we have of stressing our bones effectively? Good. Weight-bearing exercises and impact exercises. Things that have impact are going to have a greater amount of force we're going to have to deal with than things that have relatively low impact. So if you had to compare a swimmer, a cyclist, and a long distance runner, which of those three would you figure would probably have the densest bones? Bingo, because they also have the impact and the force production. Now the cyclists have a lot of force production and the swimmers obviously have the lowest, but both of those don't really have an impact to go with it. Now, let's say you're trying to get effectively, you're taking somebody that never lifts weights pretty much at all, okay? And then you put them on a typical, weight training program that involves, squatting, benching, deadlifting. Which part of the body do you guys think is going to have the greatest increase in bone mineral density? If they were relatively sedentary, they may be, they obviously walked around, they weren't just completely on bed rest. But what part of the body or parts of the body do you think are going to have the greatest increase in bone mineral density when you start lifting weights? Okay, so Cass thinks the legs. How many of you guys are in agreement with her? Okay, Catherine's on board with her. Anybody else? Okay, we got, yes, I'm sorry, I can't see which of you guys that is right now, but okay, we've got another person that's in agreement. Okay, now I want you guys to think of it along the lines of, once again, this is somebody that's just, they move around, but they're not really that physically active. Typically, how much weight is someone going to support through their torso, meaning through their spine, if they don't really ever lift weights? What's the heaviest external load you think they're going to probably carry around? Yeah, their body weight. Yeah. So for external, that's where we're talking no longer about the body weight itself. But now we're talking about, for a lot of those people, the heaviest load might be, 20 pounds or something, nothing that heavy. An empty barbell, Olympic, of course, is going to be 45 pounds. So it turns out their spine is going to be having to essentially carry way more resistance than it's used to. And then same thing with their arms, if they don't. How many times in a given day, guys, do you think someone does a push-up? That doesn't work out. Like they're just doing a push-up. Yeah. So the bones of their hands don't really ever have to produce a lot, or their bones don't have to deal with a lot of force. So just having them lifting weights, like that's going to be much greater force than what they're used to previously. And that's also going to cause those bones to remodel. Does that make sense to you guys? So the last thing that we'll go and touch on is what were the major nutrients that we want to make sure we're giving someone so we can effectively make sure we're trying to maintain, if not increase, bone mineral density if we have the signaling for it, which will be based on magnitude, direction, and total duration. Okay, calcium is a big component. What other minerals do we need? Or mineral? Okay, that's a vitamin, but vitamin D is absolutely one of them. We got one more vitamin we definitely want, along with one more mineral that we definitely want to help us with our bone mineral density. Magnesium would be that mineral. And then it's another vitamin. It's a fat soluble vitamin. So that should hopefully narrow it down. Nope. Go further down the alphabet. Vitamin K. So that's okay. That's why we review, we talk about these things and think about why they're important. Because at the end of the day, our body's constructed out of only the foods that we eat. That's it. And obviously the fluids that we drink also. So if we're trying to build more of one tissue or another, we got to make sure we're getting in those components, because, you know, we can be doing weight bearing exercise and we're doing impact exercise. We're doing everything right from a signaling standpoint in order to increase bone mineral density. But if we don't have enough calcium, vitamin D, vitamin K, and magnesium, it's not going to happen. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about those joints. So just going to be talking about the biomechanics of our skeletal articulations, which really we're talking about joints. So getting everything set up on my side so I can see your guys' comments, see if we have anybody show up being a little bit tardy. And so we effectively have four major different classifications of joints. We've got our Synovial, and these are going to be typically our wonderful sutures inside of our skull, and the syndesmoses between the tibia and the fibula. Now, the sutures of the skull move a lot more when you're young. You have that flexibility of the skull. As you get to be older, they're much more rigid. You do get a little bit of movement, but I mean, you're definitely not talking about completely dislocating one of those sutures of the skull. You're more likely to have a fracture along those lines. Now, the Diarthroses, and this is going to be slightly mobile, this is going to be our epiphyseal plates or our vertebral joints. So we do get a slight amount of movement on either side. You can kind of think of it like where we can have just a little bit of movement at our SI joint. And then, yeah, you can pop your pubic symphysis, which is a very unique sensation. If you've never had that happen to you guys, it definitely gives you a moment of pause and mild concern that you have maybe done something incorrect to your body, but it happens. Now, the joints that we're going to be dealing with mostly are going to be what's known as diarthrodial, also known as, synovial joints. These are going to be the ones where we've got cartilage on one side, we've got a capsule, which is going to be a membrane that surrounds the joint. And then inside of that capsule, we're going to have synovial fluid, which itself is going to be a lubricant, which is going to allow it to move with less friction between each side. So you can see how we've got our cartilage, we've got our capsule, a synovial fluid will be inside. And then we do have these bursa, which are going to be filled with synovial fluid that's going to work as a cushion. And notice how when we went through the upper but more the lower body, we showed how we had a number of different bursa throughout the hip, throughout the knee, as a means to obviously allow for performance with a little less friction and grinding on those joints. So we've got a number of different types of synovial joints. We've got our gliding, so that's going to be the facet joints on the back of our vertebrae. We're going to have our hinge, which would be a great example of that would be the elbow. We're going to have a pivot joint, which is going to be the radius and ulna, and that's if you grab your forearm and you twist your arm over, you can feel that moving effectively from side to side. Then you're going to have our condyloid. So this is going to be that radial carpal joint. So this is where we can go side to side, eversion, flexion, extension, and then we can have a little bit of rotation either way. The saddle, which is going to be your hip in and of itself, and then the good old ball and socket. So we're talking about the shoulder and we're talking about the hip. Obviously, each of these are going to give you varying degrees of range of motion and what would be effectively a natural amount of motion to have in those. Now, the cartilage itself, guys, allows for a greater amount of contact between the two joints. So since we've got a greater amount of contact surface area between the two joints, think back to pressure. So that same amount of force we have is now divided over a greater surface area. So we actually have a total lower amount of pressure between those joints, and that synovial fluid and the cartilage are both acting to decrease effectively the friction, and in turn, which is going to lower our total amount of mechanical wear we're going to have on a joint. So we want there to be cartilage between our joints, and unfortunately, as we get to be older, this can start to break down some and not function like it once did. So we then have what's known as fibrocartilage, and this is going to be discs or meniscus that are going to act as a pad between. So we're talking about our intervertebral discs, talking about our menisci. This once again is going to allow for an increase in surface area. So we're going to have a lower total amount of pressure, which in turn is going to make it easier for that joint to move and articulate better between the two surfaces. Now, this is useful because it's going to distribute that load. It's going to make the joint fit better. It's not going to allow for there to be a slippage between those joints, hopefully. Protect it through the peripheral because it's keeping inside. Allow for that lubrication with that synovial fluid inside of the capsule, and obviously absorbing impact and distributing shocks from any time we have, obviously a hard landing through that joint, especially if we are absorbing with our joint and not with our muscles. Now, that's kind of a weird statement to make, but at the same time, it happens. What can you guys think would be a great example of someone absorbing force with their joints and not absorbing it with their muscles? They've got the heat on in the building, so it's a little bit warm in here today. Yeah, no worries. What can you guys think of would be a good example of someone who's absorbing force with their joints as opposed to absorbing force with their muscles? Jumps is a great example. So it can really happen in any sport. So a great way of, not necessarily, it depends on how we're stopping. So if you guys were to just stand up wherever you're at and then jump as high as you can in the air, and then I want you to land as softly as possible. So try to land initially on the ball of your foot and then absorb through your ankle, your knee, and your hips. So you're literally thinking about landing and then letting yourself go into a squat. So we're absorbing that force using our musculature by allowing ourselves to obviously receive the force and descend a little bit on that impact. Whereas if we happen to be landing with straight legs locked out, you're going to have to absorb all of that force through your joints. Does that make sense? So jump as high as you can, then land straight-legged. And I think all of us will go, ooh, like I don't want to do that because that's probably going to be really uncomfortable. But that's where we're talking about having a much greater shock through our system. So we then have our articular connective tissues. And this is going to be our tendons, which are going to be connecting our muscles to our bones, and then our ligaments, which are connecting bones to other bones. Now, both of these have a certain ability to be trained so that they're going to give us effectively a little bit better of elastic recoil or keep our joints in the correct position. When we tear our tendons, obviously this is a traumatic experience and takes a long time whenever you got to reattach them. This is evidence with my right pec. Or you're going to have, if we have torn ligaments, we can have instability in that joint for the rest of our life, especially obviously if it wasn't able to be reattached. And so Tommy John surgery is done because the ulnar collateral ligament has been ruptured and has to be effectively replaced through using the palmaris longus ligament, which doesn't have much of a function anymore in the human body, so you can get away with it. Whereas you've probably met somebody that tore an Achilles tendon or something otherwise that's traumatic like that, and they are shut down for a while. Now, the key thing is every tissue in your body has a certain amount of integrity, a certain amount of force that it can tolerate. So like anything else, we're not just, when we're training, increasing our bone mineral density, increasing our muscle size, we're also increasing our tendinous thickness and potentially even our ligamentous thickness. And this is a good thing because it's actually helping protect us. And there's even the added connective tissue of the fascia that's wrapping the body, which in turn is going to work a little bit to limit ranges of motion in certain areas, depending on the collagen content, and then its obviously ability to slide. So our knee has a huge amount of articular connective tissue. We've got our MCL, LCL, our ACL, and our PCL. Now, all of these are working together along with a number of other ligaments that in turn are giving us a greater degree of security, trying to keep that hinge as safe as possible. And yet you still see quite frequently a number of athletes that happen to go through, unfortunately, knee surgery because obviously they managed to tear one of or more of the ligaments surrounding or inside of the knee thanks to trauma experienced in sport or simply changing direction. So joint stability is effectively our joint's ability to resist abnormal displacement of those articulating bones. So if we're trying to figure out how stable a joint is, so say like your elbow is not just going forward and backwards, but can we get rotation at the elbow joint in either direction? And that's something that doesn't really happen too much, but like anything else, if you've got a lot of ligamentous laxity and not a lot of effective, muscle and tendinous strength to keep it in the socket, so to speak, you can have dislocations. Now, the closer that the bone matches the surface to one another, the more stable it is. That's why you don't see a lot of elbow dislocations because it looks like kind of a wrench on the end, but it still can happen. Meanwhile, something that's relatively shallow, like the shoulder joint, is a lot easier to dislocate because our wonderful labrum and glenoid fossa happens to be pretty shallow. So in those ligaments, obviously, are going to be working to be keeping that in the socket. Once again, they're not as tight, not as strong. And then notice the absence of muscle fatigue. So if our muscles are not as well conditioned or they're simply tired, they're not going to do as good of a job of keeping our joints in the socket. So those joints that have the matching shapes gives you guys that example for thinking about looking at it and kind of seeing that true spatial representation as opposed to just thinking about it. And then we have a variety of other attachments that are going to help with that knee stability. So specifically the IT band is actually helping to keep effectively the patella aligned through essentially the patellar tendon, because it's going to be sinking through the side of the hip. The problem is that this is excessively tight. It's going to be pulling the kneecaps laterally, which in turn is going to be putting a greater amount of stress on essentially on the right side of the bone structure of the knee, whereas it's going to be, well, for this, because it's a right leg, and you might have a little bit of not just anterior knee pain, but potentially medially, because we're essentially overstretching the tendon or pulling it in an asymmetric direction. Now, we then have joint flexibility. And this is going to be the range of motion that you can go through that effectively is going to be passive. So just the lay on your back, lifting one leg up, seeing what type of range of motion you're able to go through. Now, like anything else, your joint flexibility is going to be heavily influenced by those muscles and tendons surrounding it, and the ligaments to a lesser extent. So when we're looking at flexibility about a joint, we're not necessarily looking at the ability of that joint to move always. We're sometimes looking at the surrounding tissues' ability to move. And like anything else, you're going to see a certain amount of muscular development isn't necessarily the issue. It's going to be a lack of flexibility training due to, myriad of reasons where you're not going to have as much length in those tissues. So just because you're really muscular doesn't mean you're not going to be flexible. However, if you happen to not be doing anything to help you with your flexibility, you're not going to be able to go through as large of a range of motion as someone else. Now, like anything else, our body is constantly adapting to the positions we're going through in our daily life. So a lot of you guys, since you spend a lot of your time sitting down, and I know I'm painting with a wide brush here, between obviously being in classes, sitting down for meals, commuting, you're constantly shortening your hamstrings and your hip flexors because, well, they spend a lot of time in a shortened position. Whereas if you're spending a lot of time standing up, walking around, you're not going to be shortening up those hip flexors as much, but you're not really doing much to try to lengthen those hamstrings. So that's where training and making sure that we're doing things appropriately to actually help with that range of motion. Now, flexibility is more passive. Mobility is more of what I'm interested in when it comes to sport, because that's your ability to move through a range of motion. So that's where you can see somebody who can squat down, laterally lunge. They can move themselves in a dynamic manner through a full range of motion. So obviously, not just bones and muscle, but we can also have fat that effectively is limiting our range of motion. If for individuals that have like a very large belly, it's going to be really hard for them to do the sit and reach because they're just going to run into it at some point. Now, we talked about muscles and then a little bit of collagenous tissues. Fatigue is going to be a bit of a factor. Previous injury or scar tissue, individuals that have got some issues with an injury are going to have issues with range of motion. Since my pec is now in a different spot, I've got a little bit better actually range of motion on my right side than I do my left, simply because this pec is now tied into the sternal pec is tied into my clavicular pec, so it's actually constantly in a shortened position. So that's why I kind of have the asymmetric boob job of, you can see how the right side rolls up more than the left side. And that's gonna be a component. Genetics is gonna be a component. You're going to see certain amounts of flexibility and laxity kind of runs in family, just same thing with tightness. And most folks tend to tighten up as they get older, but that's once again, typically more so due to activities of daily living, not so much due to the fact that you're just simply old. So you can see obviously older yoga masters that are going to be able to clown on any of us when it comes to mobility, but at the same time, there still are some components there to keep in mind. So what can we do to go ahead and increase our joint flexibility? Now, we want to take advantage of what's known as our Golgi tendon organs. Now, that's a stretch receptor in your tendon that when it feels the tendon being stretched, it tells the muscle to quit contracting. Whereas the muscle spindle, when it feels a stretch on the muscle, it's going to tell the muscle to contract. So if you guys are to go and get into like a really hard hamstring stretch and you feel in your hamstring, you can feel how taut that is. And sometimes if you're really pushing that stretch, you can feel it twitching because it's trying to contract to keep you from going too far. So effectively what we can try to do is get our Golgi tendon organs to fire, whereas we're trying to actually inhibit our muscle spindles. So this is where we want to go ahead and have someone try and stretch. And from there, we want to have them relax for a moment, come back and try to create active force through that muscle, which in turn is going to inhibit the muscle spindle, and then have them relax, and they're going to be able to go a bit further. So for that, you guys can look up examples of PNF stretching. I think there might be a couple examples if you just kind of do a deep dive on my YouTube channel for examples of that. And you can see how it's a decent way to help a little bit with flexibility. But flexibility training should be like all other training you do in life, which is you have to think about progressing it and periodizing it. So we're going to find ways to make it a little more difficult on occasion, and we're making sure that we're being smart with not applying too much volume too quickly, but slowly progressing our volume with time as a means to help increase our range of motion and our flexibility. So this is just another, only instead of the visual, now the actual written out points of what a muscle spindle does and what a Golgi tendon organ does. Now, one thing that's really fascinating when you're actually looking for a quick test of your muscle spindle is going to be what's known as the myostatic reflex. And so if you remember back in the day where the doctor would hit you on the the patellar tendon, and that in turn would cause your leg to twitch, well, that puts a real quick stretch through those stretch receptors, which in turn is going to cause that muscle to twitch. Now, this is something that we're naturally trying to take advantage of when we do things like plyometrics. We're trying to take advantage of the stretch shortening cycle. So we're putting a very rapid, brief stretch on the muscle, which in turn is going to help potentiate contraction along with your neurological system actively recruiting those muscles in order to get them to get you to jump. So active stretching is when we're trying to actually pull ourselves into the stretch. Passive is when we're just allowing ourselves to lower ourselves into that stretch. Keep in mind, guys, when you think about the force that you're producing when you're stretching, think about loading like you would when it comes to weight training. So for example, if I'm going to just lean over and stretch my hamstrings, I have the entire weight of my torso, my arms, and my head pulling me into that stretch. Whereas if I'm laying flat on the ground with my legs in front of me and leaning forward, I still have the weight of those, but I don't have as great of an effect of gravity because I'm no longer starting from an immediate weight going forward and all the way helping me. Instead, now I'm in a seated position. So effectively, if I'm really tight in my hamstrings, I might almost be behind 90 degrees and not be able to get as much out of that stretch. And so both of which are relatively useful. Passive is great for the fact that you obviously can just kind of hang out there and really let your body essentially stretch under the loading methodology you're using. Keep in mind, guys, with stretching also, duration is one of the major methods that you're going to try to progress it, which is if you really want to try and increase ranges of motion, typically you need to think about stretching for about, honestly, half a minute to 2 minutes to really try to lengthen tissue. So if you're really trying to increase ranges of motion, it's not done in 5-10 seconds. It's something that's going to occur because you've spent a quality amount of time in that position trying to go ahead and increase that range of motion. Now, ballistic stretching is going to be, super fast, essentially bouncing style stretching. This is going to be something that's kind of like what you do in a dynamic warm-up, but it's not a great decision if we're really trying to increase ranges of motion. Instead, we want to think about doing something more like that static stretching, where we're going to be holding that position for about 30 seconds, if not more. And this is one of the problems you guys have probably seen in a lot of sports you've maybe played growing up, where it's like, all right, guys, let's stretch out. All right, everybody, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, you don't ever spend enough time to really help increase range of motion and really help with flexibility in any of those muscles and essentially the different patterns, because you're never accumulating enough time in one position, especially at one go. So we've talked about PNF stretching a little bit earlier. It is something that can be definitely very useful to try and do, especially when we're looking at really big limitations in movement through the upper and lower body, typically more the lower body with a lot of people in their tightness, as a good way to help increase it. You can also do things like banded distraction and otherwise. Look up mobility WOD with Kelly Starrett, and then the many permutations of people effectively trying to rip him off, which, don't get me wrong, he's obviously been inspired by a number of people also as a means to help with increasing range of motion and making it so that you are going to be able to move appropriately. Now, if over a long enough period of time, we're not using our joints correctly, or even if we're using them correctly, we're just using them too much, we're going to start to get what's known as osteoarthritis. And this is effectively a degeneration of that cartilage between our joints. And so you're going to see pain, swelling in the joint, issues with range of motion, and stiffness. Now, like anything else, the overuse makes perfect sense, but what's fascinating is you can actually have it caused by effectively a lack of use, because remember, guys, all of our connective tissues, our tendons, our ligaments don't have their own blood supply. So the only way you're able to actually get blood flow to those areas and really allow those tissues to remodel is typically going to be through movement, which is in turn going to get turnover of our interstitial fluid and otherwise, which is going to allow some nutrients to be delivered to the area to allow for remodeling. So that's the major kind of catch-22 to helping yourself with joint pain, which is you need to move it, but you just need to find a way to move it that doesn't cause a lot of pain, so you can effectively get those tissues to remodel in a way that's going to be advantageous and allow you to get back to, you know, the things you enjoy in the first place. Now, when it comes to the stress that's going to be caused, you know, like anything else, that's why we talk about appropriate technique, making sure we're doing everything to the best of our ability, utilizing good control, good range of motion, and all of the other components of effectively a good, safe training program. But like anything else, this is going to be an issue that a lot of folks are going to have to confront at one point or another in their life in one or more of their joints. Which was fascinating is Dr. Sasha in the department, he and I were looking at some of his dissertation data. And what's fascinating is if you look at the regression equations for return to play for a muscle strain or sprain compared to a tendinous strain or sprain, the time to recovery to be able to play again, and this is without surgery, was 3 times longer if you had a tendinous injury as opposed to if you had a muscular injury. And that's just exactly what we just talked about, which is how much slower those tissues remodel compared to your muscle tissues. So I'm sure all of you guys are relatively familiar with all the happy little joint injuries that can occur. Like anything else, we want to make sure that we're doing our best to avoid doing anything that's going to cause excess damage to our joints, and keep in mind the amount of work that your joints are used to. We talked about Wolff's Law. Your body is constantly trying to adapt to the demands placed on it. It's going to try to do so as quickly as it can, but it cannot adapt that quickly. So if you currently don't run at all, and then you're like, oh, I'm going to go run a marathon tomorrow, you are going to be Tyrannosaurus wrecked and risk some major potential negative outcomes. Instead, it's like, okay, I don't run at all. So the first day, maybe just go out and run a quarter mile. You don't have to go and do crazy amounts. The key is slowly progressing it from there. And as we're adding volume slightly over time, allowing our body to recover, and then giving ourselves periods of time where we make things easier, periods of time where we make things harder, aka periodization and programming, we're going to have an overall increase in performance. But understand it's just not a straight linear relationship. You're not going to add another push-up every single day. At some point, that's going to get to be a little daunting, and now we got to go and give ourselves something else. The only one here that might not be very familiar with a lot of you guys is what's known as rheumatoid arthritis. And that is going to be the type of arthritis that is effectively caused by effectively it's an autoimmune attack of the joints themselves and that cartilage. And that's obviously rough. And that's going to be incredibly hard to recover. But it's an important thing because you're probably going to have a client at some point that has issues with arthritis, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. And when you have those type of situations, it's important that we're making sure that, yes, we're moving the joints, but we're trying to find a way to move the joint that's as pain-free as possible. And that's where typically you find people can usually tolerate things like swimming, but they obviously might not be able to tolerate real heavy loading and those type of movements. So, questions, comments, concerns? All right, so now I'm going to give you guys some hard things to figure out. So we're going to have you guys divide up into 3 groups. okay? Group 1 is going to tell us how fast does bone remodel. Okay, so how quickly do we really change our bone mineral density? How quickly do we increase it? Effectively, what are we doing? And you can talk a little bit about what we're going to do to cause that type of remodeling, but really I want to see how fast this really occurs and maybe some things about how we can increase it. And then group 3. Does that make sense? So we're going to split you guys up into breakout rooms. You guys are going to go through it in your groups, talk your way through it, and see what you guys come up with. Questions, comments, concerns before we send you guys into those breakout rooms? So when you come back, I'll hopefully have a fun video that I can show you of Stefan Holm and his insane increase in tendinous thickness, because tendons are incredibly important for storing and then returning that strain energy. So if you can actually develop your tendons more, you're actually going to have effectively a greater amount of stretch reflex. No questions? All right, guys. Have fun. It's 10:10 right now, so I'm gonna give you guys 10 minutes in each group minimum. So make sure you're diving down into really thinking about, okay, like really how fast do we significantly increase bone mineral density? So yes, it's gonna happen. You're gonna be starting the signaling pretty quick in all these, but how long does it take for there to be like a significant change? How long would it take in theory to double our bone mineral density, or double our tendon thickness, or double our ligamentous thickness, which is going to be insane, but it's at least going to give you an idea to look at. So have fun, guys. See you back in 10 minutes.
My Wi-Fi is awful and it has kicked me off like 3 times because it's raining at my house.
Yeah, I noticed you've been kind of having some issues with getting kicked out again and again, so I was kind of, no worries about it. Stuff happens on occasion. Don't take it too seriously. It's just gonna be even more annoying. All right, guys, it looks like we got most groups slowly getting back in here. And you guys can go ahead and throw up in the chat what you guys came up with, or you can just go ahead and unmute yourself, and we'll have the bone group start off first.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute myself because it'll take a while to write it. So we have the bone, and it says that the skeleton itself remodels about every 10 years. And what helps these changes occur is a good diet, keeping the bone under a good amount of normal stress to help them become more dense, like weight bearing, walking, running, all of that. And to make sure you take your like supplements like calcium, silicone, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc help the healing process faster. And then the nutritional support is fruits, vegetables, a good amount of protein, your vitamins and minerals, perform strength training, avoid low calorie diets, collagen supplements to help in vitamin D and K. And then hormonal signaling, we had estrogen in women, testosterone in men, and then growth hormone for both.
Awesome. Now, testosterone is also important in women, just like estrogen is important in guys. In fact, I don't know, I think we talked about this in X-Phys, but this is just one thing for you guys to understand. I don't know if we've talked about it before in this class, but do you guys, for your average woman, okay, and this is a yes or no statement, so I want you guys to answer this in the poll. Do women have more estrogen or more testosterone for your average woman? So if you think they have more estrogen, just say yes. So what's fascinating, guys, is your average woman has more testosterone than she has estrogen.
I remember that being a trick question. That's the only way I remember it.
No, that's fine. I'm obviously not above trying to trick you guys. So the key is, now that I'll resume my share, notice your average woman's estradiol is in picograms per milliliter. Average testosterone level is in what's known as nanograms per deciliter. So your actual nanogram level is 1,000 times bigger than your picograms. So women have more testosterone than they have estrogen. But then again, we really like to argue about man-made constructs like gender. So whatever, let's get all uppity about things that don't matter. But it's just an important concept to keep in mind because both hormones are important for both genders. And, you know, as a guy, and this is something that I learned not too terribly long ago, but it's an interesting effect. Do you know what estrogen for guys is actually really important for? Does anyone know what that is? Nice, Luke, but growth hormone is going to be a component there, with tendons, but I like what you guys are coming up with there. That's good. That's good. Estrogen for guys is really important so you can get an erection. Funny, actually, that's the truth. If you're a guy and you don't have enough estrogen, you can't get up for it. So which is funny is a number of pro bodybuilders will take anti-estrogen drugs as a means to try to make sure they're not converting so much of the testosterone they're supplementing with into estrogen. And that actually bites them in the behind because, well, yeah, now they can't do something else. So nice job, Luke's group. We're waiting on one more group. Oh, thank you, John. Yes, and I like how you brought up the high estrogen levels and ligament stability. Women, when they're pregnant, and specifically when they get into that second and third trimester, they start to notice that their joints become a lot looser. And that's actually due to not just estrogen, but progesterone and otherwise. It's going to help actually cause increased ligamentous laxity because, you know, they got to pass a football through the pelvic floor, which is not exactly a big area. And so that effectively allows for a greater amount of effective, you know, mobility in that area than what you find normally. So nice job, guys. Now, one thing that's fascinating is you brought up protein. Now, protein is something we get more into bioenergetics, but I do want to throw this out there now because this is important. When it comes to building tendons, ligaments, connective tissue, the amino acids, glycine and proline, and their hydroxy versions of hydroxyglycine and hydroxyproline are the most important amino acids for improving connective tissue strength. And that's why you see some people supplementing with collagen protein as a means to help with the recovery of those tissues. And that's simply because it has more of the amino acids that, are going to be specific for what you're trying to accomplish. So, good job, guys. Nice work. I like what you guys put together there. So last but not least, you guys did a great job of pointing out the fact that, you know, these tissues are going to remodel. They're going to change with time, specifically when we give them what they need and we allow them to have enough forces to remodel. And so this is a video of a gentleman by the name of Stefan Holm. Stefan Holm was an Olympic level high jumper. And so what you find is over a long enough periods of time, you actually hypertrophy your tendons. And tendons, yes, they connect the bones to the muscles, but it's much more complex than that. They effectively work like not so much like a chain connecting the two. They work more like a really, really thick rubber band or bungee cord in that they're going to not just connect the force from one to the other, but it's also going to serve as a point at which you're going to get some elastic return. So if you have very well trained tendons, you can do a better job of storing and returning elastic energy. And this is going to be quite evident when you watch this video. Stefan Holm is 5'11", just to give you guys some context of what you're about to see. He just jumped over 5 hurdles, guys, that are almost 5 feet off the ground. He's Swedish, so obviously it's okay if you don't understand a single word he's saying.
Ansatsens hastighet till en kraft, till en fart uppåt. För hur den är så förlorar du fart i upphoppsfasen i ett höjdhopp. Ju högre kommer du hoppa.
Notice that's eye level, guys. That's almost 5 feet 8 inches off the ground, and he does 5 of those hurdles in a row. Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. He was obviously also a... Catherine, you would not break every bone. You really need to work on having a higher self-opinion. But the big key is, I don't think any of us would clear one of those hurdles, much less of them, 5 of them in a row. And then notice how he, just kind of nonchalantly does it. So keep in mind, guys, tendons are really important, not just for connecting that force that our muscles are producing to the bone. They also work as force dampeners. They work to store and effectively receive a certain amount of that elastic energy. So it actually works as essentially a go-between. And so we need to have tendons that are strong enough, stiff enough, that they're going to be able to express all of the force from the muscles. But we want them to have still enough elasticity that if our muscles contracted, we can just have all that stretch go through our tendon, like pulling back a bowstring, and so we can release it immediately. And that's where you see incredible physical acts, like what Stefan Holm just did with his jumping. So that's all I've got for you guys for the day. Any other questions, comments, concerns before we go ahead and tell you guys to have a good weekend? All right, guys, getting close to the end. We're just going to talk about some muscle physiology briefly, and then we've got some drag. And then after that, it's just going to be pretty much open season on review, you guys wrapping up your projects. And then you guys have hopefully all survived biomechanics. So, well, guys, that being said, thank you guys as always for showing up and participating. Have a great day, guys. Stay safe out there, and I will see you guys on Tuesday morning. Bye-bye.